Messiah, hold forever those he loves. Does our God intend to dwell again with us? He does. Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave, he is David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slain. From every people and tribe, every nation and tongue, he has made us a kingdom and priest of God to reign with the Son. Is he worthy? Is he worthy of all blessing and honor and glory? Is he worthy? Is he worthy? Is he worthy of He is, he is, he is, he is worthy of all blessing and honor and glory. He is worthy of
Well, good morning and welcome. It is good to be back with you. A couple things. How awesome was Josh last week? He's not in here, so we're going to talk about him. Such a good job. I just found myself so encouraged this past week when I watched the video and just thought about the fact that we got to leave town, we got to take a break, and things just kept humming right along and at a really, really high level. I'll be honest with you, I'm a little nervous about ever bringing a glass of water up here, though, because I think he will be the first to let out a big old belly laugh, and that'll just be what it is. But it is so good to be back with you here this morning. We had a great trip, and it was very, very good, although we got back and hit the accelerator back to 100 miles an hour, which I think we'll be at for the rest of the month. But nevertheless, a couple things to just remind us of and have on our radars. This coming week, for those of you that have signed up, is the Camp Manawagan work trip. And out on, actually not even out, on the table here in the sanctuary, if you are signed up, we've got a little just half sheet that has our rough schedule on it. And so if you want to grab one of those so that you kind of know what's going on, when it's going on, really more than anything, the big things are like the optional breakfast Saturday morning. If you want to do that, we're going to be up extra early, but you need to bring money for that. We'll have some things to eat there that we'll provide for you. But if you want to get up and go to what I quite frankly think is the best breakfast house I have ever been at, you're going to want to bring your own money, and they have donuts the size of my head. Only slightly exaggerating, okay? I was only able to eat half. So if any of you want to split a maple bacon donut with me, we need to talk after the service. Thank you, Mike. I see that hand. All right. Very, very good. And maybe we'll buy two and take them home. It works for me. But nevertheless, hopefully giving you an idea of what we're doing, some of those spots where, it's going to be good to have some cash on you for some of those things. Next Sunday, we've got a brief vacation Bible school meeting that's going to happen in the sanctuary right after the service is done. And so that will be a point in place for us to just make sure everybody knows where they've signed up, Hopefully you've been contacted by now by somebody on the kids ministry team. They've been talking to you, and if you've got questions, bring those next Sunday, and we just want to be thinking 2 months in advance about what that day is going to look like and what all the moving parts look like, and it is continually shaping up. Now, in the church email over the last several weeks, there has been a link to click to sign up if you are planning to help, because we want to get you a staff t-shirt. And last I looked, only 1/3 of you have signed up. We've only got about 13 of our 36 people that said, yes, I plan to be there. So if you could, over this next week, click on that link, do all of that sign up. That's going to help us get the right t-shirt size for you, and then hopefully help you have what you need on that day. I want to just take a moment and talk with you about some Grace Kids 2020 stuff. And you might hear that and go, wait a minute, it's 2021. We're all just trying to forget about 2020. But let's circle back here for a moment, and let me give you about 4 years of church history in about 45 seconds, okay? So it was in 2017 that God sparked a dream and put it on the hearts of our elder team to think about what it might look like for us to add a full-time staff position at the church. That full-time staff position was for children and family ministries. It was a pastoral position, and we began in 2018 budgeting to slowly take steps to add and increase our budget so that by 2020 we would have that money in the budget and we'd be ready to start the hiring process. Well, things didn't go quite as we anticipated. There were some things along the way where our plans got shifted. A pandemic happened in the midst of that. We all found ourselves wearing masks, not sure what to do with life. And here we are, though, with some clarity that we haven't had in a couple years. And I really do mean by a couple years. Your elder team 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, asked you if we could think about what it might look like to do a part-time position instead of a full-time position. We thought, given where things were at financially, we might be able to take that step rather than a full-time step. And we had a congregational business meeting about that. You gave us permission to think about those things. Permission notwithstanding, there still wasn't a lot of clarity. There still wasn't a lot of insight into what even that would look like. And then COVID struck, and we found ourselves with a whole lot of different things to talk about. And what happened over this past year, and really beginning more in January than any other point in the last 2 years, is that I really feel like God began to give your elder team some clarity that we had not ever had before. And we began thinking about, all right, this part-time position, what could it look like? And how does it fit to the ministry team culture that we're trying to build here? We've restructured a bunch of stuff in our leadership and the way our teams are approached and the way they're built, and what does that look like, and how have our needs changed and how have they not changed, and where do all of these things fit? And so we began having those conversations, and we began plotting out, all right, so there's 5 different options we could consider. What perhaps is the one that God would have us consider for here and now? And we feel like we arrived at a point of clarity in February and beginning in March regarding that. And so we began resetting what a job description would look like. And we did some work with that ourselves. We got together with the kids ministry team and we said, okay, you're the ones on that team right now. You take a look at it. Let us know what you think about it. And we got some good, helpful feedback regarding that. And what happened this past Thursday was your elder team approved a recommendation for a part-time job description for children's director. Now, why I want to use that language the way I do is because we're not standing before you today telling you that all the details are finalized and we're ready to start a job search tomorrow. No, all it is a recommendation from square one all the way back to 2017 on December 31st when we first outlined this big idea. We have asked for your involvement and even your vote every step of the way. We wanted you to be that engaged in the process that we were asking for you, in particular members, to say, yep, we like that idea, continue going forward. And there's been a strong response every step of the way that, yes, keep going forward. And so what we have for you this morning, and they're going to be in your boxes at the end of the service. So I held them out of your boxes beforehand because I wanted to be able to talk through some of these things, especially for some of you that have not a clue what it is that this logo represents in the last 4 years of history. The job description will be back in your box for you to evaluate, for you to pray through and pray over. And members, we're going to be asking for you to give your elder team permission to move forward with this. Now, you might not be a member, and we can have that conversation at another point in time, but you're still going to get the job description in your mailbox because we want you to be just as engaged. You just don't get a vote whenever we have that meeting, but we want you engaged, and we want you thinking about it. We want you praying about it because we really think this is a really big deal for our church. And I don't have the language of emotion all worked out for you here this morning, but it would be something that would give us permission to move forward. And it would be similar to what you did with the PMI, where we asked for your input and your vote there, and we just ask you to give us a green light to go finish the details. And that would be largely what we'd be looking at. And that's because this is a director position. It's not a pastoral position. So it will bear a lot of similarities to how Damien's job description was structured, how we approached that, and even how we navigated that, where you gave us permission to do that, and we did an application process, and we worked through the interview and the reference things and all of those things, and found ourselves at a point in time where we asked Damien if he would accept our offer. And so we're going to approach it similarly, but for right now, what we need is your active engagement. And you're going to find the job description back in your mailbox. There will be some out in the foyer. If you don't have a mailbox, you can grab one there as well. But what I'd like to do is on July 11th, I'd like us to plan to stay after that Sunday morning and to have a special business meeting where we can have some conversation about this. If you've got questions or comments between now and then, by all means, please provide us with that feedback, that input, those questions, those comments. But we want to make sure that we've got something on the calendar that lets us move forward and at least lets us think about when's the next formal conversation we're going to have about this, and then we will see where we are at. If you vote and give us permission to move forward, we'll begin doing that. And if you say, nope, you need to pull back, we're not sure we're ready in there, then we will do that as well. But I find myself tremendously encouraged and, quite frankly, quite excited about what this could mean and how it fits into the broader context of what I've just watched our teams do over the last year and a half. And it's been a really exciting thing. And I think there's just been some tremendous culture shifts that have taken place. And I told our elder team in January, I have never been more excited or encouraged to lead you than I find myself right now in 2021. And so this is a big part of that. And I'm excited that we can have some clarity about it. So after the service is done, not right now, but after the service is done, make your way back to your box. We'll have it in the email over the next week as well. If you rather just have a digital copy, that's fine too. But would you take this opportunity now? Stand, say good morning and welcome to those around you.
Oh, sing hallelujah. Our hope springs eternal. Sing hallelujah. Now and ever we confess Christ our hope and life and death. Now and ever we confess Christ our hope and life and
Okay, now we go. All right. Can you make sure it's going downstairs? So we've been having some problems here this morning. So if we can make sure that that's all where it needs to be, that would be great. But like I was saying, I feel like I'm a bit of a caged animal getting set loose when we come back from a week of vacation, and I wasn't able to preach the week before. So I apologize to you in advance. But we're actually going to shrink some things down here this morning, and we're only going to be aiming to get through verse 6 just into verse 7 of 1 Peter chapter 2, because we're going to pick up 7, 8, 9, and following next week. But here's what I want us to just kind of see and think about. Peter is going to begin shifting our focus towards what it looks like to be a Christ-centered witness in the midst of persecution. And in the midst of a context where you are an elect exile and you don't feel like you're at home and things aren't the way they used to be, and perhaps it's active persecution, perhaps it's subtle persecution, it really is the answer to the question of what happens when I go to my job and my workplace is hostile towards Christianity? How do I navigate that? What happens when we find ourselves potentially looking at legislation that would make certain convictions of the Bible illegal to speak about or to uphold? What happens when I engage at Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas dinner with family that don't want anything to do with Jesus? So the language of Christ-centered witness is language that we have pulled and have tried to bring clarity to, and it's language that we've stuck on a pallet, that we've tried to keep before you week in and week out, and it really is this idea that missionaries are not those that we send to Africa. Missionaries are those who trust in Jesus. And you might be sent to Africa, but even if you're not, you're still to be thinking of yourself as a missionary, because you have a relationship with Jesus, and you've been called to be salt and light. You've been called to proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light. And we should love and support the missionaries that we have and the missionaries that we know, all sorts of different ways. But every single one of us, if we've trusted in Jesus Christ, should consider ourselves as missionaries where we are. And God may call us to a different location at some point during our lives, but what we do know right now is He's called us where we are. And you and I are to be missionaries where we are. And that's going to be your workplace, and that's going to be your school, and that's going to be your family, and that's going to be your neighborhood, and that's going to be all of these different areas that you engage in life. That's your mission field. So what do we do when we find ourselves as elect exiles? What do we do when we find ourselves grieved by various trials? What do we do, and how are we to think about Christ-centered witness in that regard? Now, I want you to go to verse 9 of 2 Peter chapter 2, because I want to show you where the idea of witness gets picked up. And then we're going to work our way back, and we're going to go into verse 4, and we're going to chart our way forward to see how it all connects there. But there Peter begins in verse 9, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of His own possession, that you," notice right here, the purpose clause, "that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light." Peter is not saying that you can give your check to the offering and the church so that they can pay somebody else to go proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you. He's not saying that. There is good reason to love and support those who are called to foreign mission fields, but that is not what Peter is saying right here. He is saying that you and I are called to proclaim the excellencies of Him who called us. So how do you do that as elect exiles? How do you do that when the heat gets turned up? How do you do that when life is hard, or the family dynamics are challenging, or your workplace is hostile, or perhaps the government just even says, not happening here? Well, as chapter 2 continues to unfold itself, Peter's actually going to get after that. And we'll see in 2 weeks where he gets after the idea of our relationship with government. He'll get after the week after that our relationship with an employer that might be hostile. He's going to step into family dynamics as well in the beginning of chapter 3. But the whole idea behind all of this, and where we're going to see this morning's text lead up to, and where we're going to see the next few weeks come from, is all about this idea of proclaiming the excellencies of Him who called you. Not finding somebody else to do it, not investing in somebody so that you can invite them to church and have the pastor tell them about Jesus. You proclaiming the excellencies. And in doing so, in explaining these things, here's where Peter's going to come back to, and he's going to do it in two ways. We're going to look at way number 1 this morning. We'll look at way number 2 next week. He is going to return to this idea that believers are part of the long, continued, and unfolding redemptive plan of God. We'll see next week, as Peter talks about those who don't believe, that he actually will make the same exact statement about them. But these passages break down into 2 parts. They're about those who believe and those who don't believe. And you can see that in verse 7 where Peter says, "So the honor is for those who believe, but for those who do not believe." And so he's going to be working from this position that there are those who have trusted in Jesus and there are those who have not trusted in Jesus. Presumably, those who have not trusted in Jesus are what is making life difficult for those who have trusted in Jesus. And so how do we make sense of that? And how do we still proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called us in the midst of that? That's where we are going over the next several weeks together as we think through what it looks like to be elect exiles, but not get a pass on engaging a lost world with the gospel. Because what Peter doesn't say is, you know what, they're going to hell, leave them alone, check out, you guys just do a holy huddle thing, get your little group together and just work on kind of always singing praise songs with one another. No. He actually unfolds some tremendously significant theological truths, and we'll do so in verses 4 and 5 that we'll look at this morning. But the whole reason he does that is to provide fuel for why and how you and I are called to a world that will be hostile to the gospel, but nevertheless desperately needs it. So that's where we're going. So before we jump into verse 4, would you pray with me? And then we'll try to make some sense out of what Peter has written. Well, God in heaven, we ask that you would, in these next several moments, give us eyes to see and ears to hear, minds that understand, hearts that would believe, hands and feet, tongues, lips that would do. God, help us to understand what it is that your Spirit inspired Peter to write. And how there is tremendous and honest acknowledgement to the difficulty of the situation these believers find themselves in. And yet they are called to walk in holiness. We are called to walk in holiness. That we are called to love one another, that we are called to long and crave for pure spiritual milk, and we are called to proclaim the excellencies of you who called us. And so, God, as we try to get our minds wrapped around some really significant and profound theological truths from the Old Testament, would you help us to think well? Help our minds to understand correctly. And God, would you let these truths in our lives and in our hearts be the very fuel that you intend them to be, that they would propel us to proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called us out of darkness and into His marvelous light. So God, we thank you for the gospel, this living stone, Jesus, that has risen from the grave and has called us to himself and made us a people. We pray this in his good name. Amen. We'll go to verse 4 with me here as we pick up what Peter is writing. You're going to see he begins there, as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves. So he's going to eventually get to verse 7 where he concludes this little section to say, so the honor is for those who believe, but for those who do not believe, he's going to go right back and begin quoting some Old Testament passages to show even there that there is a continuation of the long continued and unfolding redemptive plan of God. But here Peter begins with you and I. And he does so by saying, as you come to him. More specifically, the word there, or those groups of words, translates one word, and it's the idea of coming. It's the idea of drawing near. Peter's expressing this not in a sort of condition. It's not if you decide to come to him. He's acknowledging and just says, look, you're coming. You're coming because that's what believers do. You're longing for pure spiritual milk. You're craving pure spiritual milk if indeed you've tasted and seen that the Lord is good, because that's what people do who have tasted and seen that the Lord is good. You come and you draw near. And this word coming is the word the author of Hebrews says, and our English Bibles translate, draw near. And so the author of Hebrews says, look, in your time of need, draw near. Come to him. Come to the throne. Because in those moments, you're going to find mercy. And you're going to receive grace. You're going to receive mercy. And you're going to find grace. The context there is regarding temptation. And ultimately, in chapters 3 and 4 of Hebrews, the context is being tempted not to believe. Being tempted to reject who Christ is. And Peter, similarly, is saying, you're coming. Because that's what believers do. You're longing for pure spiritual milk because that's what believers do. And he's going to begin using some metaphors and some imagery and some Old Testament connections to help his audience and by extension us understand a little bit more of how significant this is and what's going on in the midst of this. Since he says that Jesus is a living stone. But notice that stone, the stone of Jesus, was rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. Now in verse 5, he says, you yourselves, so he's lumping us in at this point with Jesus. Okay, so if it was true of him, if he was rejected by men but chosen and precious by God, you and I should conclude the exact same thing. So in the broader context of 1 Peter, you're elect exiles. You've been grieved by various trials. We'll get to verse 11 next week. You are strangers and exiles in the midst of the Gentile culture that you find yourselves in. Like, this is kind of, we don't feel like home, and yet I'm chosen and precious according to God. I might be rejected by men, but I've been chosen and considered precious because I have placed my faith and trust in the living stone. I've been born again with an imperishable seed. I've been born again through the good news and my faith in the good news that was proclaimed to me through the Word of God, the living and abiding Word of God. And the grass may wither and the flowers may fail, but the Word of God stands forever, is what Peter wrote that we looked at last week. And this good news is the news that was preached. This good news is the imperishable seed. This good news is the gospel of Jesus. And so you come to him. And as you do, you may be rejected by men, but take heart, your Savior was also. But just as he was chosen and precious before the Father, you are as well. And you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. So the first image that Peter gives us is the image of stones. And he says, look, Jesus was a living and is a living stone. He's going to, in verse 6 and 7, he's going to unfold that further to say he's actually the cornerstone that we just sang about. And he's going to say, you as well are living stones. And as John read this morning, we are built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, and this body is being built. It's being built into a spiritual house. There's the second image that Peter gives us. The first is that of you and I as stones, and not the little troll guys that were rolling around in the beginning of the Frozen movies. We're stones built on the foundation of Jesus as the cornerstone, and we're being built into something. We're being built into a temple. We're being built into a spiritual house. The third image that Peter's going to give us is that of a royal priesthood. And I want us just for a moment to step out of Peter and think really big picture. Okay, we're talking Genesis to Revelation, big picture here for a moment. Because if you want to try to understand the gospel and access to God, this idea of a relationship with God, there's four primary ways to understand it. And they all have to do with persons and places, or places and persons. That's exactly what Peter has said. The place is a spiritual house. The person is the priesthood. Let's just think about this for a moment. Let's kind of put on our Genesis to Revelation hats for a moment. In the garden, access to God was unstained by sin. Adam and Eve, they walked with God in the cool of the day. He talked with them. They had conversation with him. It was unstained by sin. It was, as a place, centralized. It was in the garden, and it was direct. Their access to God as persons was direct, and it was centralized. It happened in the garden. Well, sin came into the world. They received the consequences for that sin, which include being kicked out of the garden, and there's a cherubim with a flaming sword, like, you guys aren't coming back here, and unfolding another 2,000 years of history. You then have the temple and tabernacle system given by God throughout the book of Exodus, and more specifically in the book of Leviticus, which is outlining all the rules that the tribe of Levi, who are the priests, are supposed to follow in leading the nation of Israel. And there, access to God was restrained by a 4-inch fabric wall called the veil. There, access to God was central and indirect. It was centralized where you went to the temple or you went to the tabernacle. The place was the house. It might have been a tent as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. It became a temple, though, and it was central. That's where you took your goat. But it was indirect because you only got access to God through the high priest, and that only happened once a year and only by blood sacrifice. And Leviticus 16 outlines the rules and regulations for the Day of Atonement. Access to God in the tabernacle and temple, think Old Testament, was restrained by the veil, which was a 4-inch thick fabric wall. But it was centralized and it was indirect. However, Christ came and he tore that veil, literally the veil tearing while he is on the cross, having yielded and gave his last breath. It tore from top to bottom, symbolizing that now access to God through Jesus has radically changed in what is called the New Covenant. Access to God in the New Covenant is and has been obtained by Jesus. It is now it is direct but decentralized. So it's direct in this way. If you've placed your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, you've received the Holy Spirit. You don't need any other mediator. There is one mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ, who has sent his Spirit to live in you when you place your faith and trust in Jesus. 2 weeks ago, we did bread and the cup at the end of our Sunday morning here together. I gave you no instructions about when to have the bread, when to have the cup, what to do, how to do it. I gave you a bunch of passages and just said, be reflective and think about it. And the reason I did that, because you don't need me to take you to God. You have Jesus. You don't need a priest to take you to God. You have Jesus. You don't need the mother of Jesus to take you to God. You have Jesus. Access to God is decentralized now. You and I aren't going to Jerusalem. It's a bit of a hotbed of activity at the moment, but it's direct. And it's not even through another human agent. It's directly through God himself and Jesus, who has placed his Spirit, which Peter said, the Spirit of Christ, his Spirit to live inside of us. So individually, we're his temple. Collectively, we are also his temple. Access to God in the new covenant has been obtained by Jesus. It is decentralized, but it is direct. And access in the new heavens and the new earth, by the time we get to Revelation 21 and 22, is again centralized, but it's again direct. And what Adam and Eve enjoyed in regards to their relationship with God, believers will one day enjoy for the rest and all of eternity, as Revelation 21 and 22 unfolds this new heaven and new earth, where Jesus will be there. He will be ruling and reigning, and it will be perfect and sinless. It is direct, and it is centralized. So for us to try to understand what Peter is saying here, we need to understand a little bit of this language that he's using. So when he says, you are being built into a spiritual house, you are a holy priesthood, he's identifying places and persons which were central to understanding how you got access to God. And at the new covenant, where we find ourselves at this point in time in history, he's saying, this has happened. You are being built into a spiritual house. You are a royal priesthood. You have access to God. Not through some other human, not through the guy you pay on Sunday mornings to talk with you, not through whomever. You have access to God because of what Christ has done. So we come to him, this living stone. He was rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, and ourselves are like living stones, and we're being built into a spiritual house. We're being built into a holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. The idea there of these spiritual sacrifices are what would be language that would, again, take our focus back to what the priesthood did. But we're not coming with the blood of bulls and goats. We come in the name of Jesus, and ultimately the greatest spiritual sacrifice is, here's my life. Here's my life. So I might find myself as an elect exile in this moment. I might find myself in the crosshairs of my government. I find myself not fitting into culture at large as they move very quickly from a foundational understanding of what humanity is based on the Scriptures. I might find myself in the crosshairs of my family when we get together for Thanksgiving or Christmas. I might find myself in the crosshairs of my employer who's hostile to Christianity because we're not at all doing anything that remotely sniffs of what the Bible reveals to be true. But you're a living stone. You're a royal or holy priesthood. You're being built into a spiritual house. You yourself are the temple of the Holy Spirit. Collectively, we are equally the temple of the Holy Spirit. And Peter dives deep into some heavy Old Testament imagery and theology, all for the purpose of getting us to think about what it means to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness and into his marvelous light. And he says, you've been saved to offer these sacrifices. Josh did a great job of summarizing kind of how Peter had structured his commands. If you think back to what he said last week, he said that in the very beginning, in verses 13, the commands that were given largely gave us instruction on how we were to behave towards God. Set your mind on the grace that is to be brought to you at the coming of Jesus Christ. Be holy because he is holy. And then Josh himself worked through a command to love one another. And that's how we're supposed to behave towards those inside the family. And Josh did a great job of unpacking that. And it was fun to see myself on the screen and to hear that I might have encouraged some envy in his heart. And I was actually feeding him all of those pictures as we were getting on and off the rides. But we were loving one another. And that ride is as good as he thinks it is. And so I'm really excited for him to get there. Josh said the beginning of chapter 2 was how we're to behave towards ourselves. What does it look like to be a believer? Longing for pure spiritual milk. Growing in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. Being more like Jesus today than I was yesterday because of my time with the Word of God. And here, throughout chapter 2, Peter says, this is what it looks like to behave towards those outside the family. And he begins that whole conversation with a deep dive into some Old Testament theology. Because for Peter, as moved and carried along by the Spirit of God, who was inspiring him to write what he wrote, this matters. And it matters because believers are part of the long, continued, and unfolding redemptive plan of God. And so in verse 6, Peter's going to explicitly take us there, and he's going to say, "For it stands in Scripture." Now, he has been alluding to this all along. And this is not the first time that Peter's quoted the Old Testament. This is not the first time he's given a passing reference to the Old Testament. There are dozens of them throughout this entire book. But here he very explicitly says, "For it stands. It is contained in Scripture. Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." And so the honor, verse 7, is for you who believe, but for you who do not believe, and he's going to then quote Old Testament references, which we'll try to get our minds wrapped around next week together. But here's the big idea of what Peter's saying. It's not that complicated. It is not that complicated. Yes, the heat might be turned up. Yes, it might be a little bit more uncomfortable right now and growing more uncomfortable right now than it's ever been before in the history of our nation. Yes, your family dynamics might be really challenging. Yes, your workplace might be hostile to the things of the Lord, but it's not that complicated because the honor is for those who believe. You might be rejected by men, but the honor is for those who believe. And the honor is for those who believe because the Father laid a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious. And we know and understand his name to be Jesus, who is risen from the grave and whom we are built on. Well, this quotation that Peter writes in verse 6 comes from Isaiah 28. And I actually want you to go there because we're going to try to work through all 22 of these verses very, very quickly. And here's where you think I'm crazy, but just hold on. We're going to try to get it done, and we're going to try to see what we can do. But this is a really, really important passage of Scripture. This is actually a passage that shows up in the Apostle Paul's writing when he goes on to explain why uninterpreted speaking in tongues when the church people gathered is an actually form of God's judgment, not his glory. Okay, so Paul hits on Isaiah 28. Peter hits on Isaiah 28. There's some really significant things happening here. And to understand Isaiah 28, you got to understand the mission and ministry of Isaiah and what was happening in the nation of Israel. They had largely, completely turned their back on the Lord, and the people followed some bad leadership. And those leaders led them away from the things of God. In Isaiah's ministry, he was called in Isaiah 6 to preach what God told him to preach. And Isaiah looks at the content of that sermon and he goes, I don't think people are going to like it. How long do I got to say this? And God's like, you're going to say that until 90% of everybody who hears you decides to turn their back on me. All right, how about that for a church growth strategy? Okay, just say what I say. 10% are going to be left. We're going to call them a remnant. And then from there, I'm going to go and rebuild. That's all of Isaiah's ministry. You get to Isaiah 28. It's been going on for a while. And he writes, the proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim. Go down to verse 3. The proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim. Isaiah is specifically speaking about the king and the kings who are reigning and ruling, and the fact that they're poor in doing that job. 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles outlines in sometimes painful detail of the really bad kings that gave leadership to the nation of Israel. Well, here, Isaiah identifies them as drunkards. That will actually roll forward to where you get to verse 7, where the priests and the prophets are there right alongside of them, and their dining room tables are filled with vomit, because it's that much of an indulgence of theirs. They're giving poor leadership. Verse 5, in that day, the Lord of hosts will be a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty to the remnant of his people. So notice the interchange here. The crown is terribly leading. A large number of people are following their example. But for those who haven't, God himself will be a crown. He will be a crown of beauty for his remnant. And there will be a spirit of injustice. Because these kings, these priests, and these prophets were not just finding themselves drunk and unable to give any type of leadership. They were drunk and giving poor leadership. And the idea of injustice comes up time and time and time again through the Old Testament prophets. God has a lot to say about injustice, and he's got a lot of hard things to say to those who might come or lead in his name who are propagating injustice. But he will bring justice. And he will bring strength to those who turn back the battle at the gate. And in verse 7, these also reel with wine and stagger with strong drink. It's the priest and the prophet. Throughout the Old Testament, there were three main offices in the nation and people of Israel: prophet, priest, and king. All of them are leading poorly. Verse 8, their tables are full of filthy vomit, and there's no space left. Now, here's what they are saying about Isaiah in verse 9. To whom will he teach knowledge? Who's this prophet going to give knowledge to? And to whom is he going to explain what God has told him to say? Those who are weaned from milk and those taken from the breast? Are it just babies and toddlers that are going to be able to understand what Isaiah has to say? Because we have found ourselves in a position of elite understanding of the things of the Lord, and it's led us to having tables full of vomit. But we don't need this baby talk, this simple message from God about what he has to say, because we've moved far beyond that. And what Isaiah has to say is actually just for the little kids, because we've matured beyond and past. And in verse 10, they speak about Isaiah's message. It's just precept upon precept. Precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line. Here a little, there a little. The idea there is that it's simple and that it's understandable. His message, you might as well communicate it to 4-year-olds. It's simple, and he just methodically builds one idea after the other. Precept upon precept, line upon line, a little here, a little there. It's simple, it's understandable, and they reject him because he has some things to say about their behavior. Now, it's in verses 11, 12, and 13 that the Lord brings judgment. And here's where Paul quotes Isaiah 28, and he says, "For by the people of strange lips and with a foreign tongue the Lord will speak to his people, to whom he has said, this is rest. Give rest to the weary, and this is repose." Yet they would not hear it. And so Isaiah is saying, guys, this is actually what your souls crave. This is what God designed you for. The filthy vomit occupying all of the space on your dining room tables, this is not God's best for you. This is not what he has for you. But they rejected his message because it was simple and it was understandable. And God was saying, this is what you want. This is what I've designed and made you for. And they rejected him for it. And so God says, okay, I'm going to bring in the Assyrian army. They're going to have a language you do not understand. And you know what they're going to say? Go to verse 13. They're going to say exactly what Isaiah said. But they're going to say it in a way that you won't understand it because you rejected the simple and understandable truths that were in your own language. Now, it's in verses 14 through 21 that we pick up the language of cornerstone. "Therefore, hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers, who rule this people in Jerusalem. Because you have said, we made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have an agreement. When the overwhelming whip passes through, it will not come to us. For we've made lies our refuge, and in falsehood have we taken shelter. Therefore, thus says the Lord God." The idea behind verses 14 and 15 is that these people had a confidence that was misplaced. It might have been in some political alliances that they had. They might have been looking at some strategic agreements they had made where, you know what, the Assyrians might come, but we got Egypt on our side. Or this army might invade, but we got them to come and help us. So they're not concerned about what's going to potentially happen. They found themselves arrogant and puffed up. "And therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am the one who has laid as a foundation in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. And whoever believes will not be in haste." That word haste has the idea behind it that they will not run from the fight. They will not turn their back when the enemy comes, because in the Lord's strength and on the foundation of the stone that he laid, they will fight with strength. In Isaiah 28, and in the ministry of Isaiah, the idea is it's not that complicated. It goes back to the gospel. It goes back to the gospel, the word that was preached, that was empowered by the Spirit of God, that took root in your soul by the foreknowledge and choice of God the Father. When you trusted in Jesus Christ, you were born again to a living hope. And you find yourselves as elect exiles in this place and time. You find yourselves not fitting in because of your relationship with Jesus, but the answer is not to find ways to shrink back so that the heat might get turned down. The answer is to crave pure spiritual milk and not shrink back, but move forward. Not somehow be less of a passionate follower, but to be more. Now, the backside of that is the heat's probably going to get turned back up or even increase. To which God would say, whoever believes will not be put to shame. But whoever does not believe will. So on the front side of helping us think through what it looks like to proclaim the excellencies of him who has called us out of darkness into his marvelous light, Peter gives some deeply profound Old Testament imagery and quotations to help us understand that as believers, we are part of the long continued and unfolding redemptive plan of God, and it really is not that complicated. The prophet, priest, and king in Isaiah's day stumbled on the fact that they were expecting a message from the Lord that they couldn't understand. They wanted to be wowed by something they couldn't get their minds wrapped around, and yet God says, no, I came to you in just precept after precept, line after line, here a little, there a little, and they rejected him. And Isaiah is saying, look, this stone has been laid, and Peter picks up on this language and says, this is what God has done. And for those who have believed, there will not be shame but honor, regardless of how hot the heat becomes, because they're being built on the foundation of that cornerstone. And they've been built for the reason that they might proclaim the excellencies of him who called them. Not so that they can find ways to wholly huddle and to not be salt and light and to not let their good works shine so that all men might see them and give praise and glory to their Father who is in heaven. He says, no, you push forward and the heat might get turned up. But there is glory and there is praise and there is honor for those who walk in faithful obedience. And so set your minds on the grace that is to be brought. Love one another. Walk in holiness. Crave for pure spiritual milk. Because we have a cornerstone. And our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. Would you pray with me? Oh God, we thank you for that hope that you have given us. This cornerstone that you have given us, this solid ground that we can stand on. And God, help us to see how these deep theological images and truths that borrow from passages in the Old Testament we don't often find ourselves reading in our devotions each and every day, how they matter to our day today. That what the temple and tabernacle was and what the priesthood did and what Christ has now obtained because of his blood, it matters. And that imagery is images and metaphors that you use to strengthen and encourage our faith. God, help us to not lay a foundation on anything else but the cornerstone of Jesus, in whom our hope is found. And we pray this in his good name. Amen. Would you stand as they lead us in closing?
My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, his face. I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. My anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found, dressed in His righteousness alone. Faultless I stand before the throne. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. We praise you this morning, Lord, that you are Lord of all, our rock, our salvation, and our cornerstone. And we just go out this week glorifying you and singing your praises. In your name, amen. Well, thank you for joining us. Great worshiping with you again. Have a wonderful week. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks again for joining us, and be sure to check us out on the World Wide Web